Hi all, welcome to our webinar today presented by Verdantix and Cority. We are excited to delve into the topic around uniting and unifying operational and sustainability efforts through stronger data. So as many of you on the line here know, and many have firsthand experience of, there have been so many changes, evolving expectations, and requirements when it comes to the sustainability landscape. But amidst all this change, there is one piece that really becomes the foundation that helps organizations move from proactive compliance to proactive or reactive compliance to proactive performance. And that is operational data. And when harnessed effectively, the data doesn't just tell us what has happened or what is happening in our companies, but it can tell us where we're headed and how resilient we can be along the way. So we're really excited to delve into this topic today with our partners over at Verdantix, sharing more of their powerful research. Before we dive in, just some quick housekeeping items to share on how to navigate the platform that you're currently on. So please feel free to type in any questions you may have throughout the presentation into the Q&A box located on the left-hand side of the screen. We have allotted some time at the end of today's session to answer these questions, so as they pop up in your head, feel free to pop them into the box. In the toolbar, you'll also find a short survey for today's webinar experience, and we kindly ask that you take a moment to complete it at the end of the session. If you do have to leave before the live session concludes, feel free to fill out the survey before you go. And finally, you'll also notice a collection of resources linked below the slides today for you to access, in addition to our featured content. So feel free to peruse those links when you do get a chance. And should you wish to connect with a Cority expert to learn more about what we do and our EHS Plus software solutions, we do invite you to submit a demo request via the widget on the bottom left. So a quick intro to the faces you see on the screen here. My name is Isha, and I'm the Product Marketing Manager for our Environmental and Sustainability Solutions here at Cority. I'm based in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, where it's getting colder and snowier by the day. But I'm excited to be here with you all as the moderator for our presentation. And with me, I have our main speaker and star for today, Gus Brewer, who I'll hand it over to now to do a quick introduction and then kick us off for this exciting discussion. So over to you, Gus.
Yeah, thank you very much, Isha. It's really exciting to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So as Isha mentioned, I'm Gus Brewer. I'm an industry analyst at Verdantix. I sit within the net zero and energy transition team, researching things like decarbonization, net zero targets, emission management, carbon management, all that fun stuff that we'll be touching on today. So yeah, big thank you for Cority for having me on, and really excited to kind of jump into this discussion. So before we start, I just want to give a kind of quick brief outline of what we'll be covering, and we've broken that down into 4 key areas. So firstly, we're looking to just contextualize this whole discussion, thinking about the importance of operational data for firms with their sustainability agendas. Next, we'll look at some of the challenges firms are facing when it comes to emissions management, looking at a lot of our Verdantix data and deep diving into some of our global corporate surveys to really understand the challenges firms are facing today. We'll then look at the role of emissions management software. So how can software help with all these challenges that firms are facing? And at that point, we'll kind of get some input from Isha and the Cority team to really understand how they're helping with these challenges. And then finally, we want to leave you with some kind of practical steps to take away with you and to think about and what you can actually do. So let's jump straight into that first section in the kind of context setting. So I wanted to take a kind of step back and see what's been happening within the sustainability space in the last 12 months. One of the kind of biggest and most prominent trends that we've seen is that scaling back of net zero targets. We saw a lot of these targets set between 2015 and 2020, which were kind of set very ambitiously and maybe potentially without kind of practical steps for how firms could achieve that. And now today, what we're seeing is firms are facing almost a backlash of that, where they don't have the kind of right levers in place to deal with these challenges. So firms are walking back targets for a number of different reasons, be that kind of technology availability. We saw that with Walmart earlier this year in the bottom right-hand corner here. We've also seen things like economic headwinds, so kind of less than favorable macro conditions that perhaps we didn't see 5 years ago pre-COVID, but we're seeing now are kind of meaning sustainability is being pushed down agendas. Emissions management isn't as an important topic as some other things. And this is kind of causing firms to miss these targets. And then also we've seen kind of varying government support in different regions around the world. And I think these factors kind of highlight the flaws in that first round of targets that was set, where firms were perhaps too ambitious without kind of clear roadmaps to how they were actually going to achieve this goal. So effectively, what we're seeing now is almost a market correction in decarbonisation, where firms need to be much more realistic about their goals. And in many cases, that means scaling back these targets. But I wouldn't say it is all doom and gloom. Whilst there are kind of firms walking back their targets, that isn't the full picture, and it's kind of a lot more complicated than that. What we're seeing is firms are starting to be much more strategic with their net zero goals. So rather than focusing on these big, lofty 2050, 2030 targets, firms are being much more specific and measurable with their goals. You can see here the likes of, say, Meta we have on the screen, who are looking to target kind of specific resources, so moving from steel and concrete to timber and wood, or Mars, for example, who are kind of focused specifically on value chain electricity emissions, and there's kind of the examples here go on. And as you can see in the top right-hand corner, this is kind of one of our Verdantix predictions from earlier this year. And we were saying that firms are going to be targeting much more tangible operation interventions rather than just high-level goals, which, yeah, sure, they sound great on paper, but they do very little to actually advance their decarbonisation. And so it's kind of that shift that we're seeing in how these firms approach their targets. And it's not that they're going away, they're just changing. And why bring all of this up now? I guess the big point about these new targets is the importance of operational data within them. These asset and business specific targets, they require firms to think about their operations in a much more granular way. And that's why those kind of operational emissions and emissions management is such an important topic, and why we're kind of discussing it today. So I guess it's easy to look at kind of cherry-picked articles that say firms are doing this or firms aren't doing that, but what does our actual Verdantix data say about all of this? So this is data from our global corporate surveys from both 2024 and 2025. These surveys are conducted with 350 sustainability leaders kind of across the world in almost 20 different industries. So kind of a really good, solid data set. And what it shows is firms actually still do have strong confidence in their ability to hit targets, with average confidence in the long and short term rated above a 7, even in 2024, and then just a slight decline into 2025. And even though there perhaps is a slight shift down, we don't think this reflects weaker ambition, but it reflects kind of more of an awareness of the scale and the work ahead and what firms actually need to achieve these targets. And then if we look on the left-hand side as well, we can kind of further support this idea where just 1 in 8 leaders report reducing or delaying or walking back their climate targets. And that's kind of, I guess, almost a far cry from the idea that net zero targets are dead in the water. So I think the key message here is, yes, there's been a lot of noise around net zero in the last 12 months, but it's certainly not going away. It's kind of evolving, and there's becoming a much greater focus on operational decarbonisation to actually achieve these goals, as opposed to these kind of big, lofty targets. So what are some of the kind of other challenges firms are facing today when they think about kind of decarbonisation, their sustainability agendas, and so forth? So this again is from our global corporate survey from this year, and it shows a real mix of external pressures, but also internal data issues. So if we take those internal pressures first, we can clearly see at the top here that unstable climate policy sticking out. I think of note this year, we've seen kind of lots of change within regulations, be that CSRD, kind of sustainability reporting and disclosure in the US kind of all but disappearing. So clearly this is a big talking point, and I think it makes a lot of sense that this is top of mind for a lot of firms at 43%, which is kind of the most of any respondent. But what's interesting here is if we look below that kind of first challenge and look at the next four, which we've highlighted within this box, I think we can link all of these challenges to data quality. So key pain points like supply chain dependencies, building a business case for decarbonization, even cost pressures, they're all challenges that require a solid data architecture, and can be mitigated, or at least can help reduce the burden of these problems when you actually kind of think about the data that goes into them. And really what we're seeing is that that data can help create more of a common structure almost. It reduces the need for manual tasks, and really improves that accuracy. And so, yeah, okay, we'll see those external pressures continue, and that those are kind of big important topics. But when we look at those internal issues, we can really think about that strong data foundation, which is really important for firms. So I just wanted to build on that idea a little bit with quite a basic framework, but one that I think illustrates the idea quite nicely of how operational data helps to build out better decisions throughout firms, and really helps them to achieve their goals. So here, what we're trying to illustrate is that operational emissions data is really the foundation for all decarbonization work. It sits at the base of every layer that comes above that, be that kind of reporting, analysis, or kind of any action that you take. And so without a really kind of solid and accurate base, everything else above that is going to become much weaker. So things like targets, you don't have the clarity or the understanding of what's going on if you don't know what you're kind of looking at. And this is why this topic is so important for us to talk about. It's kind of the core element for performance, for credibility, and for kind of long-term goals as well. And so I guess that is the reason why today we want to discuss this topic, why we want to talk about it, understand the challenges that firms are facing, so that you can build on this data foundation to then inform those layers above that, analyzing and understanding your problems, or actually acting and actually decarbonizing. So that kind of provides us with a context for what we're going to be discussing today. But next, let's move into some of the challenges.
Awesome. Thanks, Gus. Yeah, let's do a quick pulse check with the group first, just to see how folks are experiencing and what you're experiencing with your companies today. So you should see a poll on your screen, and we'd like to know, what is the biggest emissions reporting challenge your firm currently faces? Is it that your teams are operating in isolation? Is there a general lack of accountability? Is data hard to standardize, or are you having trouble reporting on value chain and suppliers? Or are you experts and have no problems when it comes to reporting? Let us know. We will give it just a second here. Perfect. See some submissions coming in. We'll give it 4 more seconds. All right, wrapping up. Perfect. I think we have a good number. Okay, data is hard to standardize. That is the top contender, and that is the perfect segue into our next section. So back to you, Gus.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, I think this is really interesting, and I think once we kind of get onto the next slide, it kind of reaffirms a lot of what we're seeing. I think that's especially true across organizations. So kind of understanding how different teams work with the same data but report it differently is kind of a challenge that is happening at the moment. So I think we'll jump straight into the next slide, and we can kind of delve into this one slightly further. So here we have some more data from one of our corporate surveys earlier this year, where we asked respondents to rank information management challenges based on frequency and then how time consuming they are. And so both of these were given a score 1 through 10, and then we've effectively plotted the scores each have given on this graph. And so if we look in the top right-hand corner, we can see the challenges that firms struggle with the most. What I think is interesting is what we just saw on that previous slide, standardizing data, is interesting because obviously we've got the centralizing data across internal departments and systems, which links directly to that, and also in improving data quality and accuracy. So clearly some correlation between our research and what we're seeing here. I guess first, if we take the collecting data from our supply chain as that kind of furthest right-hand point, this is clearly a challenge firms have struggled with for forever. I think Scope 3 emissions has been kind of the number one challenge, and we've all heard and dealt with that kind of over many years, I think, because of the complexity of supply chains, because of the education issues associated with it, and then more just generally the scale of this challenge, which makes up kind of 70 to say 90% of firms' emissions traditionally. So it makes a lot of sense for that to be kind of right in that top right-hand corner. We can also see that data quality is a key challenge. So I guess what that tells us is that sustainability disclosures are probably or are under increased scrutiny, and things like rough estimates, which aren't necessarily auditable or similar, aren't really good enough for firms anymore. And so firms are really struggling with that as well. But I think what's the most interesting data point here, and I think what was being alluded to on that previous slide as well, or that poll we just conducted, is a standout challenge here, is that the challenge of firms centralizing data across their different kind of teams and systems and whatever it might be. And what this boils down to is firms are still collecting their data in kind of siloed chunks. So procurement teams collect database from supply chains, logistics still deal with things like transport, and then the sustainability teams kind of stitches that all together and sits above that. And in reality, that doesn't really work. Each kind of team has their own process they follow, each group has their own data, and they use different tools. And this effectively slows reporting. It creates gaps where firms don't kind of fill out the information correctly. And it makes it harder for kind of corporate teams to fully understand what's actually going on in the layers below them. And so with all those kind of different sources of information, it's difficult to align that information and actually kind of put that into the day-to-day operations of a business. So I think it's really clear here to see that when there are operational silos, it really weakens decarbonization progress, because it slows the information that's coming in and it really reduces the accuracy. And so firms really need to think about how they can change that and how they can align those teams better. And so we've outlined that challenge, and clearly firms care about it, but let's spell out how this is actually happening in practicality, sorry. So here we can see on the one side, we have the sustainability team, on the other, we have the operations, and there's almost a wall between these two teams right now, and what their goals are and what they're trying to achieve. So they're using different tools, they kind of operate on different timelines, and they have different goals. So for sustainability teams, it's about tracking corporate targets, which we spoke about already. It's about kind of regulation and compliance and those high-level indicators, whereas the operations teams are much more focused on, say, asset performance or kind of improving that real-time efficiency of a workflow or an asset or whatever it might be. And it's all kind of much more short-term orientated. And effectively, when it comes to reporting, this creates gaps in the data or what they're prioritizing or the decision-making in general. And so without a shared system or shared goals or just better communication between the two, it's difficult to actually link this strategy with real action and real change and real decarbonization. And this is really one of the main issues we're seeing within organizations at the moment. And clearly, based on our poll today, it's kind of something that you guys are also struggling with too. So again, I wanted to include some of our data here because there's clearly a big challenge, but our data here shows that connecting corporate sustainability strategy with operational action is actually going to become a priority in the next 12 months. So if we look on the left-hand side here, we can see that over a third of firms think this is the most important objective. So here we're seeing how sustainability is no longer a standalone initiative, and it's starting to become much more embedded within investment decisions. And then this is also what that data is pointed to on the right-hand side as well, with 63% of firms suggesting that building decarbonisation investment plans within financial but also operational teams is the most important decarbonisation in the next 12 months. So clearly with this data, it points to that sustainability teams want the operations team involved in these decisions, but currently they don't have the data for them to build the business case to help with their decarbonisation or to help with their sustainability agenda. But this is something that firms are going to try and work on and build out in the next 12 months. So just one more data point from our corporate survey to kind of highlight this point and what's going wrong at the moment. So from the previous slide, we saw that firms want to bridge that gap between corporate strategy and operational action. But what this data is showing us is that firms are still very reliant on spreadsheets and manual tools for core emissions tasks. The data here shows that around 50% of firms aren't using any software to support emissions management. And when I think Excel and kind of spreadsheets work great when it's high-level targets and you don't need lots of accuracy and detailed information. And that worked in the early stage of net zero targets and kind of those high and lofty targets that we spoke about earlier. But now as firms are moving towards much more kind of asset-specific decarbonisation and actually trying to reduce their emissions as opposed to just measuring as kind of a rough estimate, this is kind of showing the flaws in this system. And this is kind of one of the reasons why we saw those people failing on their targets or those firms failing on their targets earlier. Because spreadsheets can create those issues like kind of having multiple versions, which people are plugging data into the wrong information, or you can't consolidate that information, or there's kind of prone to manual errors, things like this. And if firms really want to make real progress, they need to shift away from these manual workflows and much more towards a system that prioritizes centralized data, that has those automatic checks in place to help with the data collection and supports that shared ownership throughout an organization. And so what is it that happens when a firm is too reliant on manual or outdated tools? And I've got kind of a quite a basic graphic or image, but I think it does well at kind of illustrating the point we want to get across here. And effectively, when no one owns the numbers, accuracy fails or data becomes inconsistent. So here, each facility can kind of record their own information in their own way. Some report kind of instantly, some do it once a year, some do it quarterly, others don't report at all. And then that means for corporate sustainability teams, they have to then fill in these gaps, these estimates, or try patch together data that doesn't necessarily align with each other and try and make sense of all of this. But really what this is doing is just weakening all the data that you get. You might get good data from one person, but if it's poor from someone else, you don't really know what you've got and you can't really use that to actually inform strategy. And so without clear ownership, firms can't trust the data that's feeding into those targets or into those reporting metrics. And so it's a real kind of complex issue that firms are dealing with, and it kind of highlights why spreadsheets and these informal processes that don't have clear structures don't really work right now. And that strong structure and ownership is really vital if firms want that reliable emissions data that's then going to help them with their reporting, yes, but also actually reducing emissions more generally. So here is kind of how that data process works. It's obviously a lot to take in when you first look at it. But I think if we take this as much more of a high level way, then we can see that there's actually just three core processes at play with this data collection, emissions management, carbon management system. And so that first one is that data collection piece we see on the left. The second one is the data aggregation and management we see in the top middle. And then the third one is reporting and program management. And so if we think of them as just those three buckets here, it becomes a lot simpler and we can kind of build out from there. So firstly, that data collection piece on the left-hand side, we can see there are a number of different data sources involved in this process, and we'll touch on this a bit more in a second. We then have the data aggregation and management, and I think you can think of this as almost the workhorse of a carbon management program or of an emissions management program, and it does all the things like sorting and processing of information. And then finally, you have those kind of outputs at the bottom. And that currently exists through things like emissions reporting, so be that voluntary or mandatory frameworks, and then also things like net zero program management, so decarbonisation initiatives, net zero targets, those kind of things. But what I really want to focus on and what we've been talking about before is that data collection and emissions kind of reporting piece, and how that is a core aspect here, and firms should really focus on that to start with. So if we just highlight this, so we can see here that these are basically the data inputs that go into calculating your firm's emissions, and that varies from, we can see at the top, operational data, and then all the way to things like supplier emissions as well. And what's important to highlight here is that all these inputs form the foundation of what is to come later in that data aggregation and management, and then the emissions reporting and that net zero program management as well. So for things, say, like hotspot analysis or for target alignment, it all relies on that first stage to be able to produce that output. And so if bad data goes in, then bad data is going to come out. There is no silver bullet in that data aggregation and management piece that's going to be able to turn bad into good within this process. And so it's vital that when that data comes in, it's actually providing you with the value that you require. And so I think the message here is that this is a really complicated process, but if it doesn't start well, and if the different stakeholders aren't involved with their different roles, and they don't understand what the kind of common goal here, and they're not all speaking the same language, then you're not going to achieve the goals you want, because if you get bad data in, then the whole process becomes redundant. And I guess that's kind of why we're here today. That's why this topic is so important, and it's really important for firms to focus on, to make sure you're getting the most out of your sustainability program. Great. So now we'll look at the role of emissions management software. So we've obviously spoken about spreadsheets and all that kind of stuff, and the challenges that are associated with it, but how can firms use software to kind of help with that? And to start with, we've got a quick poll question or two.
Yeah, thanks, Gus. So we have a double poll for you all. We're curious, do you currently use software to help with your emissions management? So just a quick yes or no here. We'll give it just a few seconds to see how you all respond. So anyone here kind of using software externally or having manual processes, we'd love to know. Perfect. We'll give it just 4 more seconds to get submissions in. Okay, perfect. Okay, so pretty solid split. We see most folks, 61% are using emission software, with 38% not using it currently. So kind of the second parter to this is, when it comes to software, what is the most important capability for your firm as it relates to emissions management? So is it that data ingestion and acquisition piece that Gus mentioned? Is it more on the second or the third bucket, the reporting side? Is it broader, related to strategy and target setting and initiatives? Or is it more about bridging internal gaps and working on that collaboration and workflow management piece? So we'd love to know, what is currently your biggest capability that you're looking for when it comes to your software solution? Perfect. I see some responses coming in. We'll give it just 30 more seconds here. All right. Final few. Right. Perfect. 5 more seconds, get those answers in, and done. Cool. Okay, data ingestion is the big one, which I think goes well in hand of what you talked about, Gus. So yeah, sets us up well for the next section.
Yeah, Yeah, it's always good when we do these polls and the kind of stuff we talk about then does actually come up. And I think even on the previous one, looking at how many people actually are using software compared to not, it kind of aligns with the stuff we're seeing in our research as well. So yeah, I think data ingestion is a massive one, is always going to be a massive one. But with the use of software and firms helping, it can be a massive help. So yeah, really interesting stuff. Let's move on and let's talk about software a bit more then. So I guess when we talk about emissions management software, it'd be good to start with the basics. So what are the real benefits that firms are actually gaining from this type of software? For me, I think that boils down to probably three main points, and in that it gives firms structure, more consistency, and just much better visibility of what they're managing and what they're kind of reporting and what they're trying to decarbonize. Um, and we've broken that down here into collaboration, data, and strategy. And so, firstly, with collaboration, so we've spoken about those different teams, so sustainability teams, operations teams, finance teams, procurement teams, when they can all work with the same information rather than in separate spreadsheets or in disconnected systems, they all can work towards a unified goal. They all can sit within that same platform, and that means that information isn't lost. Workflows are much clearer, and this can really help to kind of streamline that whole process. The second is it creates a place for operational data to sit, for financial data to sit, and for those kind of emissions factors to work over that data. That does this by standardizing the formats. It can automate those core tasks. So I know we saw data ingestion being a kind of big challenge that people were referencing on that poll earlier. And software here can really help to automate those processes using kind of things like APIs and scanning of documents to get that data in much quicker, and kind of avoiding those manual entries, removing kind of version issues, things like that. And essentially it takes it from the first step of data collection we saw in that last section and moves it to that data in the engine room, which can manipulate that data for you, which is just removes those manual tasks, and it is really useful for firms. I think with that, it kind of creates much better reliability for the data you have. It strengthens the data quality by applying rules. Checks are put in place and automation is put in place there, and then can just support much larger frequencies. So things like scaling up this data collection, and that gives firms a much clearer picture of the performance across assets and facilities, and gives you kind of the whole picture as opposed to just kind of isolated kind of data pieces you're able to collect manually. And then finally is that strategy piece where software also links to targets and goals, and actually using that with the activity data that you have. So this connection helps firms to see whether their actions support the results they expect. And this is really important when it comes to that asset-specific decarbonization that we mentioned earlier, where granular data is really the key to achieving this goal. And without those kind of two previous steps, you're not going to have that final strategy, third step, where you do have the granular data to start decarbonizing through kind of asset-specific tasks that you want. And so I think to kind of almost summarize those all together, it effectively gives firms the structure they need to treat emissions data with the kind of same discipline that we've seen with financial data for kind of however long. And it then is the foundation for everything that can come after that. So I wanted to briefly touch on AI. I feel like we can't do one of these presentations without talking about AI at least a little bit. And I think with emissions management, with carbon management, there's some really powerful and useful AI use cases that we are seeing in kind of in practical use already. And so on the previous slides, we looked at the challenges that firms are dealing with, and you can see at the top here, so things like unmapped data, quality issues, manual accounting, missing supplier information, and really these problems come down to the nature of emissions data. It is big, it's messy, it comes from a lot of different sources and formats, and it constantly needs interpreting or cleaning or whatever it might be. And I think this is where AI can genuinely help make a difference with emissions data because of the patterns that it can produce. And AI is very good at spotting those in larger data sets, and it can pick up those anomalies, it can fill in those gaps, it can classify the information or flag information that you might not otherwise have seen. And yeah, I think a lot of the time sustainability teams can do this work, but it would take weeks at a time to get some of these tasks done, where this can happen in moments, and you can then look at it and sense check the work. And that really kind of improves the speed that you're getting these tasks done. It can help with the accuracy of these processes without having to pile in more kind of human hours. And so we recently did a Smart Innovators at Verdantix looking at AI capabilities within the kind of emissions management, carbon management space. And it is rapidly becoming table stakes for a lot of these vendors. They are incorporating automation into data collections, emissions calculations, and analytics. And I think some of the most exciting and the best capabilities we saw are things like AI for things like regulatory reporting and compliance. So things like writing those reports for you and kind of giving you a first pass, and meaning you don't actually have to do all of that manual work. We're also seeing things like AI algorithms for forecasting emissions using things like financial budgets and other relevant data. And so that's kind of moving beyond that basic kind of sustainability and using kind of financial ready data to prove a business case for whatever it might be, or if it's a decarbonization initiative or whatever. And then also we're seeing AI being used to recommend kind of abatement opportunities, so how to actually decarbonize operations. And then just using AI more natively with things like LLMs, I guess like almost ChatGPT style chatbots, where you can kind of ask it questions, and it's kind of changing the way that a lot of firms are interacting with their software systems more generally. One thing I do think that's important to note here is that it's not about like replacing people. Teams are still making the decisions. It's just AI is elevating that process and providing insights that you can already find, but it's the workload and it's the time frame from which they're working in now, and it's helping that out massively. I guess the one caveat also is that AI works best when the underlying data is strong. We spoke earlier about kind of poor data in, poor data out. That's the exact same here, and so having that core basic data architecture is really fundamental when you're thinking about kind of what are the AI use cases for our business and for our software we're going to be using. And so we've spoken a lot about that data collection and validation and reporting, but the next step is really moving from operational to strategic benefits when using software. So those kind of basic features are important, but the value doesn't end there. Once firms have that reliable operational data, the discussion shifts from reporting to actual strategy. And the figure here is basically trying to demonstrate how you take that next step up in operational benefits to those strategic ones once you have that data architecture in place. So software really allows firms to take that next step and think about the strategic benefits. So things like performance forecasting, benchmarking, project management. And essentially this is taking firms from a reactive stance to a much more proactive one that can really help deliver business value. And so by integrating software, it's that next step up and it's that next jump, and it can really, really make a difference for firms. And so the final slide in this section, but I think it shows an important point. And I guess before I continue, I saw a question coming in asking about how many respondents did we have for these questions from the data that I'm showing. So these are from our global corporate survey, and it's from 355 respondents. So kind of a big data set, so it has some kind of real significance to it. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that even with those benefits that we're talking about, adoption is actually still limited. So many firms don't actually give that site access to those shared platforms. and that's slowing progress and it's weakening the links between strategy and actual execution. So what we're seeing here is that 60% of operational teams don't actually have access to the platforms that they are being used within organizations. So clearly there's a disconnect here, and more firms need to prioritize connecting those dots to improve access to software platforms that can enable better progress on their sustainability goals that we've kind of mentioned already. So with that, I think it's the perfect time to hand back over to Isha and the Cority team to walk us through what they're doing to help firms with their emissions management and sustainability challenges.
Perfect. Thanks, Gus. So as mentioned prior, many organizations, again, really face those same core obstacles, and these gaps can complicate reporting and make it difficult to maintain that required accuracy, auditability, and confidence in results. And that's where software can kind of come in. So at Cority, we offer a converged EHS Plus platform and ecosystem that really addresses these challenges head on. And what do we mean by converged here? It's really this idea of consolidating the EHS operational data and that broader sustainability data across your value chain into a single ecosystem, which is showcased in this graphic here. And through that, we can create a unified source of emissions information, reduce duplicated effort, and really build that deeper confidence. And a big area that we see firms struggle with is really that data acquisition and alignment piece, which is what the Verdantix data shows, and the polls validated as well. So with our solutions, we've made this to be extra configurable, either with both manual options and automated options, and also through AI capabilities as well. And from here, the tools really allow metrics to flow between teams, break down any silos that exist, and allow firms to get that deeper view into asset level operations for stronger risk management. And the result, again, is that auditable, accurate foundation that supports firms to better strategic efforts. And that's the perfect segue to hand back to Gus to speak more about this future state piece and what firms can do to sort of move the needle on said effort. So back to you, Gus.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Isha. Yeah, and I think that point you mentioned about kind of carbon and EHS kind of coming together is something I want to touch on in a moment as well. So yeah, really interesting to see. So now we've just got the final section where I want to talk about what firms can actually do and what firms should actually be thinking about when it comes to their operational emissions data. So earlier we saw how emissions information comes from lots of different sources, thinking about things like different sites, different meters, lots of different equipment, or just suppliers in general. And that's all feeding into that kind of data ingestion process. And when each of these kind of workflows is separate, teams can spend a lot of time preparing the same data in different formats for lots of different outputs. And what we're trying to exemplify with this slide is how a single operational data layer really matters for firms, and it can save you kind of so much time. If firms can work towards that one data foundation, they can measure once and then report across kind of many different needs. So the same layer can feed regulations, voluntary frameworks, internal strategy. So thinking about things like net zero targets, decarbonization, and it removes that cycle of collecting and then cleaning and reworking the data every single time, kind of repeating that task over and over again. But what's also important to note here is that it's hard to do that with spreadsheets alone. Everyone knows the struggle of kind of losing an Excel spreadsheet. But when it's kind of in that software, it's much easier to kind of search and find and standardize that data and apply those checks and distribute the same information across those multiple workflows and using them for be that regulation, be that kind of your voluntary disclosure or your decarbonization initiatives. So as Isha was mentioning with kind of Cority and their platform and that convergence between carbon management and EHS, firms should really think about how their systems fit together. So many currently treat carbon management software and EHS platforms as separate, but in practice, these systems are really starting to overlap a lot more as we kind of progress in this market. So because both deal with operational activity data, both support workflows across different sites and both connect that corporate team with those facilities and those operations team. There's kind of a lot more overlap than is often kind of first thought. And what's really useful is if you can get a system that supports both these areas, because if you've got these separate tools and you're measuring these different metrics at different levels, it's just adding extra complexity, extra reporting, extra training where it's not necessary. And so here we can clearly see that convergence is happening. So capabilities like asset level tracking, regulatory reporting, real-time monitoring, they're all capabilities that occur across both types of platforms, but by bringing these together underneath one roof, it can really reduce that burden and improve integration, which ultimately is just saving time and money. And so I think firms should really kind of pay attention to the systems that they have, where the integration can work, where it can't, and it's not just carbon management and EHS. There's also kind of lots of applicability with things like energy management systems as well, building management systems. So it's a convergence of software that's kind of been spread out, but now coming back together again. And then the final piece I wanted to touch on is quite a simple one, but it is that idea of kind of using software to help future-proof your emissions management. We've spoken a lot about this today already, but essentially software saves you time. It puts different teams on the same page, and it automates those tasks which are quite complex, laborious, and difficult for those operations teams to handle on their own. And that means that you're getting that connection between the operations team and the sustainability teams. So from things like data ingestion all the way to scenario analysis to decarbonization initiatives, and then also kind of thinking about AI's integration as well. Software can really reduce that workload between the two work streams and create a clear view of what's going on within your system and how you can change those factors and how you can improve your efficiencies and things like this. And so with that software, firms can really strengthen their accuracy, improve the speed at which things is being collected, and just improve that overall collaboration. And so I wanted to finish with just three key takeaways or three insights to take with you from this session. That first one is to build a strong operational data foundation, standardizing data streams, reducing manual processes. It helps to give firms accurate and consistent information to support that reporting, and then also beyond that into your kind of decarbonization initiatives. And this is really, as we outlined earlier, is that building block to any emissions management program. That second piece is all about removing the silos between sustainability and operations team. And it's really important for firms to view these as one unit and get these teams to work together, speak the same language, to make sure those data flows that are kind of moving between the two teams are helping progress agendas and progressing your decarbonization initiatives. And then the third one is all about kind of using software to improve these capabilities, to improve what we've been speaking about throughout this session. It brings structure, it brings automation, and it brings visibility. And really, if you're looking for kind of advance that sustainability agenda, it should be kind of something you're considering, something you're thinking about, and something you're integrating within your kind of wider agenda. So that is everything we wanted to cover today. We now have some time for some questions, so please do chuck them in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as possible.
Perfect. Thanks, Gus, for that wonderful presentation. Lots of data and metrics to sort of chew on and marinate with. We do have some time for questions, and I see some in the chat here. So kind of the first one for you, Gus, with the regulatory pushback in the last year, like we talked about at the front end of the session, is it still important to measure emissions? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, absolutely. I think regulatory pushback this year has obviously been a massive topic, but it's just one aspect of sustainability agendas, and it's not, you don't report sustainability issues you don't do sustainability because of reporting. It's kind of a byproduct and has become a big thing in the last couple of years. But when a sustainability program, when an emissions management program is carried out correctly, it saves you costs, it saves you time, and it's better for the environment. And those should be the kind of factors that are driving your program. It should never be a compliance first approach, or it doesn't help if it is a compliance first approach. There's plenty of other reasons why
Hmm.
firms should be engaging in these activities.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, amazing. We have another one, and I'm happy to take a first pass at this one. It's what are some ways that companies can build a business case for emissions reporting software? So that's a great question and something that comes up a bunch when we work with customers across the world. And I would say when you're making a case for the software, keep it simple and really focus on the operational and strategic side. You know, software will save teams a ton of time by automating all that messy data work. It'll provide cleaner insights so you can actually spot and select and act on cost saving opportunities again at that asset level. Software can really help your, focus on reduction efforts where they matter the most, and shows your stakeholders that you are serious about sustainability and kind of what Gus alluded to before, making it more than just compliance focused. Um, and one other critical point is as you grow your efforts and as you kind of make your operations larger, the software can scale with you and it can plug into your existing system so you're not sort of rebuilding processes and workflows later on. So that would be my sort of first half of this. But Gus, let me know if anything to add to that one.
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think what's really important is that kind of with that data, you can see kind of those hotspots. You can see where your emissions are the highest and why they are, and that can really lead to some cost savings, things like energy efficiency. There's a lot of kind of money to be saved and money to be made, and so there is a real business case for those emissions reporting software. And yeah, it's really important to kind of engage these programs.
Absolutely. Awesome. We'll take one final question from the chat here. So, could you speak a little bit more on how accurate emissions reporting helps organizations identify and mitigate operational or reputational risks tied to performance? So, Gus, I know we chatted about that quite extensively in this presentation, but any sort of last points you wanted to hammer home?
Yeah, so I think we spoke about emissions or kind of data being the base of sustainability reporting. So it's kind of really important to have that accurate data that goes into your program to actually kind of maximize the value and get that use. And then the other point to build on that is that refocusing of those net zero targets from kind of high level targets to much more asset specific decarbonization. And if you're going to do that, if you want to engage those kind of programs, you need that granular data to inform it. I think one other thing is when we were carrying out that net zero target research earlier this year, we were looking at how the public sentiment reacted to firms walking back their targets. And for firms who had been making the effort, who had been attempting to reduce their emissions, but had maybe just missed a target, the backlash was nowhere near as severe. We weren't seeing things like boycotting or anything like that for those firms. So it's about making the effort, and even if you kind of don't necessarily hit 100% of your target, it's still kind of really useful. So it's important that you kind of keep going with that and make that effort.
Wonderful. Awesome. Thank you so much, Gus. I think we'll wrap it up here, folks. Thank you so much for joining us today for this session. A quick reminder that there is that short survey for you to fill out. We'd love to hear from you. But other than that, we hope you have a wonderful day, and thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much, all. It's been a great session. Thanks for your time, and thank you, Isha.
Thanks, Gus.